Well, it's interesting. I mean, religion itself, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, yes. The answer is yes. It can be really great. It can really, really bad. My favorite quote about religion is somebody who said, I think it was a German theologian named Niebuhr. He said, religion tends to make good people better and bad people worse. And I really love it. My biggest beef with religion in general is the things that are true about it are true whether you have to sign on that religion or not. Even atheists can accept it as true. And the things that aren't true, we don't need them if they're not true. We don't have to lie to people to be good when there's already good reasons for people to be good. We don't have to demonize the other. We can all, get along together. And we don't need a big sky daddy threatening us with eternal punishment for that. And yet these tropes and these tools that religion have used, they go back a long way. So they're hard to shake off, But it's fascinating also to see where they came from, because in the early days, you didn't have a sky father. You didn't have a heaven or a hell. All these things that we take for granted because we've got thousands of years of evolution behind it. We think this is what religion is, but
Broaderlands Podcast.
The opinions expressed on Broaderlands Podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands Podcast.
David, welcome to Broaderlands Podcast. What an honor to have you.
Boo boo, the pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much.
No, thank you. And I was telling you earlier, I'll probably lose a few viewers, but you know what? Everyone's so sensitive. It's called Broaderlands Podcast for a reason.
There you go. And I don't think you will, honestly. I think you enjoyed today's show.
No, I first heard you on Myth Vision. I've been following Derek for a long time, and he's had some great people like yourself or Dennis McDonald or Robin Walsh or, Bart Ehrman. Poor guy, he gets a lot of heat sometimes, but
I love him. I give him.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've just been very open-minded and, so yeah, I've had some crazy experiences. I've had outer body experiences and stuff like that. So I've always caught me questioning. There's so much more, questioning religion. We're taught not to question religion, but, and we're here to talk about, some of that right now today. And, question if Jesus actually existed. Some people it's a touchy subject, even in the secular circles, right?
It's funny how, you expect it to be touchy among Christian circles because, else are they going to say, but it was bizarre to me when I wrote my book Nailed, which I see on your shelf there. What a pretty picture that is. I was surprised how much pushback I got from my fellow atheists. And they were saying, they were lumping it in with, Holocaust denial and, saying the moon landing was fake or the earth is flat. And it was really amazing to me to see how much it changed between the time I wrote that book and 7 years later when I wrote the follow-up book, Jesus, Mything, and Action. In 2010, people were saying, oh, no, there definitely was a Jesus. He wasn't the Son of God. There definitely was Jesus. 7 years later, when I wrote the new book, it was like, oh, yeah, I never thought there was Jesus. My mind. And the thing that's even crazy, I've been looking into the Jesus historicity issue for 25 years now. And it's not an important question. I don't know if you're an atheist exactly, or an agnostic. I'm not sure how you identify.
I actually don't identify with either.
Fair enough.
I'm probably an agnostic when it comes to Jesus.
Gotcha.
But I call myself a seeker, a spiritual seeker, but I don't even hold on to that too tightly.
Fair enough. Yeah, I don't want to include you I don't want to speak for you if I'm.
Oh, I don't mind. I love to learn from people from all walks of life and beliefs and whatever.
Yeah.
And I try to keep it a safe place for people to share their truth. And because we live in a world, if you don't think like me or act like me, you're against me. And,
absolutely.
People argue about the flat earth and the round earth. I go like, who gives a shit? Regardless, if we don't learn how to get along here, we're going to blow up that flat earth or that round earth. It just.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I feel about the Jesus issue too. It's like, if you're an atheist, you don't have to think there was no Jesus. we'll be perfectly fine atheists whether there was a Jesus or not. But for me, what makes it a debate worth having, first of all, it's fascinating to see where this big enchilada we call Christianity came from. And by extension, all the other religions too. And we can talk about that in a little bit too. But what makes it important for all the people who insist there was a Jesus and the ones who insist there wasn't is everything we learn in that back and forth helps us better debunk somebody who says, oh, yes, I know how Jesus wants you to behave and think and vote. That's one thing that makes it worth having, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, one thing that I've always questioned is, okay, I know I have a relative, one of my sisters, she's, a conservative Christian, and she's like, well, why is this Jesus name everywhere all over the world? I go, because the conqueror, the Christians conquered everyone's culture, and they raped, they tortured,
same reason,
And I seen a quote the other day, it's Halloween time, and it said something like, we're taught to fear the witches, but we're never taught to fear who burned them. I have a book on Diego de Landa, who was the first bishop of Yucatan. And in his diary, it's a copy of his diary, and I could only imagine what they didn't put in there. But he's talking about burning. He showed how they burned the natives in Mexico area, how they the Maya, and what they did to the women. Some of them were just burned. He wrote it in this thing. These two were pretty women. She was a virgin. She was not. She was married, but we burned them because we wanted to burn them before the Spaniards came. The rest of the Spaniards came. I'm like, wow. And I live in Arizona where there's an Indian school road. I'm surprised it's still that name, but you go all the way down to where they would convert kidnap the natives, and it shows exactly how they come in as a native, and then they're given a new name. They cut their hair, change their clothes, and they talk about being raped, molested, and all that stuff. So I was like, what the heck? Like, where was Jesus at during that time? Why is it only cool that when it's pretty experiences, but where was he when all this stuff was happening? Or even with the first African, the first slave boat was named Jesus. They labeled the first two people that were African, Adam and Eve. I'm like, wow.
Wow.
So it is a touchy subject, and I'm not here to put anybody down, but I like I said, I call myself a spiritual seeker. I want to know what's truth, and I don't even know what truth is anymore.
And that's the problem. We live in a time where people are actively trying to destroy our belief in the truth, that you can even find truth, and that's what the Russians do. That's what the Soviets did. That's what Putin is a master of. Put 8 stories out there so nobody knows what to believe, and everyone's in the kind of off-kilter gray area when it comes to the truth. The world is not flat. In fact, we have proof, and we can prove it. And the fact that's a sign of how bad things have gotten when some bedrock of science, there are people out there who are like, well, I saw this thing on YouTube, and now I'm not sure. It's like, no, my brother.
Have you ever seen the Mesopotamian drawing of the solar system, and they have that the round Earth? They should have drew it like this if it was flat. It was just it always amazed me how they knew all that stuff back then.
Well, it's funny if you read the Old Testament, and their description of what the cosmology is taken right from the Mesopotamian. And it's like a snow globe basically. There's a hard, firmament, and there's water above it, water below it. It's wild to see that making a comeback.
Yeah. Maybe you can start off with a little bit about who you are and your background, the things you've done, you accomplished.
Sure. So my name is Dave Fitzgerald, and I've been an atheist activist and just sort of a civil rights activist since the 90s in San Francisco. I was the founder of, I was an atheist activist in the Bay Area. I was the founder of the world's first atheist film festival, co-founder. I was co-founder of Evolutionpalooza, the world of the Bay Area's oldest Darwin Day festival. But most people know me for when I started getting involved with the Jesus historicity movement with a book called Nailed and a set of books called Jesus, Mything, and Action. And now I have a new set of books, another 3-part series called Playing God, An Evolutionary History of World Religion. In all those books, I started out with the book Nailed. The whole title is 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And I don't mean any hyperbole. I'm not trying to be provocative. I really think there was no Jesus at all. And Nailed went out to show like the top 10 ways that the official story we get from Christianity fails, whether Christianity is true or not, whether Jesus was real or not. These are the things we know were not true. Towards the end of the book, I have a chapter saying, "Can Jesus be saved?" where I just list out all the things, these questions I had that would have to be answered before I could even think there was just a guy named Jesus. And again, nothing implausible about that. There's nothing stupid to think there was a guy who founded a religion. It's just the closer we look at it, our evidence, the less it looks like that's the case, and the more it looks like we're barking up the wrong tree. I wrote that book, Nailed. A couple of years later, I wrote a follow-up, Jesus, Mything in Action, and talking about where it looks like Christianity actually came from, and where the Christianity, Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus in the New Testament, and Jesus outside the Bible, and just sort of the whole first century context, talking about that. And one of the side effects of being this Jesus historist, this Jesus mythicist guy, if you will, is over the years, I would have Buddhists come up to me at conferences and say, "Hey, yeah, it's funny. We're having the same discussion in our circles about whether Buddha exists or not." Ex-Muslims would come up to me and say, "Yeah, you know what? We're having the same discussions in our circle to see if Muhammad exists or not." And so these things have been rattling around for quite some time in my brain. And just within the last 3 years or so, there's been some really amazing discoveries about early Judaism and early Islam, among early Christianity as well. So much so that I was writing a book on sex and violence in the Bible. I stopped, put that on hold, and immediately wrote this book talking about checking out the founder figures of all the world religions. In fact, checking out all the evolutionary stages that all world religions seem to have gone through. And there's so much there. I'm trying to think where I should start next. But basically, when you go through all our major world religions, your Buddhas, your Muhammads, your Jesuses, East and West, looking at the founder figures, they all seem to be made up. So much so that my biggest takeaway from this new book, Playing God, is that it seemed to be the norm for major world religions to start out with a purely imaginary founder figure. Yeah. So, well, starting there, yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I've always felt, and I quote a lot of what, like Jesus or the Buddha or whatever, but I know that it's mythology. I've always known that these are myths that every religion is centered in. Even when I was in Egypt, I was with one of the a brilliant chematologist, and he has a site there, and he goes, Horus and Osiris, this is all mythology. And it's interesting to see how much, and I would love to get into this later, how much the Egyptian influence has on the Bible that most people ain't aware of. How would you define mythology, and do you see it as positive or negative or both, or and how does that help shape our culture and our belief systems?
Great question. I mean, there's nothing wrong with mythology. It's just that when we mistake mythology for history, that's when we start running into problems. And that's history. I mean, that's religious history in a nutshell. It's taking scriptural history, and trying to say that this is the real history. And you can't trust, doesn't matter what religion we're talking about, you can never trust scriptural history ever for any reason, because they're all there to sell you a religion. And they all want to put the universe in this little religion-shaped box. And as long as we keep that in mind, I mean, if we treated religion the way we treat literature, and say, this Winnie the Pooh story is awesome, this Lord of the Rings scene is great, it's when we start saying, oh no, Aesop's fable is real, and there literally was a hare and a tortoise, and if you don't believe that, we're going to burn you. That's where it starts getting ridiculous and toxic. And that's what religions do, unfortunately.
I mean, I like the root meaning of religion, where it means to rebind or reconnect. And a lot of times, like growing up into having traumatic experiences and all that stuff, if I actually apply those principles and try to be a better person,
Yeah.
I can reconnect myself with my heart, and be more loving and kind to people. But when
Yeah.
I think it's the belief systems, the stories behind all that, which creates the collective egos, and division.
Well, and that's not a mistake. That's not a bug. That's the feature.
Mhm.
That word comes from binding because they meant to bind all these people together under one umbrella, under one rule. And I talk about that a lot in Playing God. Is how it starts in prehistory, it starts even pre-human. But as social animals, as we get bigger and go from family size to tribe size to clan size to uh, city state to empire, and as it gets bigger and more inclusive, the God and the religion has to get more transcendent and has to be can't just have a hill god or a river god. You have to have a god of everybody who's above it all and who loves everybody. It's not just the Hopi god or the Navajo god. No, this is the everybody god. Um, and yeah, you get and you see. It's funny because I say in the book, religions, they all look so different. They've got their own vocabulary, their own art, their own music, their own dogma. They all look like they're their own universes, and they are. But when you look at their origins and their development and zoom out into that big picture, they all start looking exactly alike. They all look like they were created, usually by somebody who's in charge of a lot of people from different cultures, different languages, and different societies. And they're trying to bind them all together under one roof. Um, and you just see those steps by step throughout history. And it's no coincidence that no matter where you're talking about in the world, you start to see those same things start to happen at each stage of civilization. Yeah.
Interesting. In the
Yeah.
Gospel of Philip, there's a line that says, "Man made God in the image of man."
Yeah.
Uh,
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, religion itself, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, yes. The answer is yes. It can be really great. It can really, really bad. My favorite quote about religion is somebody who said, I think it was a German theologian named Niebuhr. He said, "Religion tends to make good people better and bad people worse," and I
mm,
really love it. Um,
I love that.
my biggest beef with religion in general is the things that are true about it are true whether you have to sign on that religion or not. Even atheists can accept it as true. And the things that aren't true, we don't need them if they're not true. We don't have to lie to people to be good when there's already good reasons for people to be good. Um, we don't have to demonize the other. We can all, you know, uh, can all get along together. And we don't need a big sky daddy threatening
Yeah.
us with eternal punishment for that. And yet these tropes and these tools that religion have used, they go back a long way. So they're hard to shake off. But it's fascinating also to see where they came from, because in the early days, you didn't have a sky father. You didn't have a heaven or a hell. All these things that we take for granted because we've got thousands of years of evolution behind it. We think this is what religion is, but we wouldn't even recognize Christianity 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, let alone 2,000 years ago. Every single one of us, Christian or religious or not religious, they would have all been burned at the stake.
I love your shirt. I seen you wearing a shirt, something you got a PhD in heresy. And I love the Greek word for heresy, because it means choice. And
Right?
if you look at Orthodox, it means to think straight, and it's usually told by authority. Look
Yep.
this way, don't look that way, don't question anything. And I
Well,
even find that in the 12-step communities. I think the Supreme Court labeled it as a religion, and they say it's a spiritual movement. But what's interesting is you can't question anything. The book becomes the gospel of God, written by God. But and I always tell people, if it's written by God, then why is the science off?
exactly.
It's just you can't question anything anymore in group
And,
think.
and that honestly, right there in a nutshell, that's my biggest problem with it all. It's like, say what you want about whether it's truth or not, but the fact that you can't question it, that's a huge problem right there. And I'm so jealous. It's usually women, it seems like, who they were raised in the church and it just never took, because they were given, looking at it sideways right from the get go. It's like, that doesn't add up. Hey, that doesn't make any sense. And people like me who raised Southern Baptist. I just believed it all, and that was the one true way, all the way into college age. And
I wasn't really forced with like any religion. I think my parents were both little thugs on the streets, but we would go to like the Catholicism where every once in a great while on a holiday, and I
Yeah.
would see as a little boy like Jesus bleeding, and like and they would say it's because of your sins he died for you, and
Right.
I think that created a little religious trauma in me because I don't know how to process that as a little boy.
Yeah.
I'm not good enough came into play and all that other stuff.
Absolutely. And that's a perfectly natural human response to this messed up brain control effort of that.
Mm.
I mean, here's the thing. God loves you, but you're a sinner, and you're a sinner because somebody else did, and you're born that way, and you can never not be a sinner. But we've got the cure for it right over here. So it's like they sell you the disease and the cure. And there's a great organization, I don't know if you're aware of it, Recovering from Religion Foundation, and also Freedom from Religion Foundation. Both of those are really awesome. But what I especially love about Recovering from Religion is they sort of focus in on that kind of religious trauma from people who grew up with these things, and it really messed up their head,
Can we get into your background? You say you were raised Christian. What caused you to start? Maybe share a little bit about your upbringing and share about what caused you to start to question
Sure.
Christianity and Jesus and all these biblical characters.
For sure. Yeah. Like I said, I was raised Southern Baptist, and so that was the one true faith. And I knew all the answers. I knew why all the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses were going to hell. I knew Bible this. And what changed my mind, I have friends who are former pastors and former rabbis and preachers, and they talk about the months and the years of struggle, how they'd wrestle with these things, and finally got to the point where they gave up on it and said, this doesn't make sense. I'm not a Christian anymore. But I can remember the moment I was a true blue Southern Baptist, believed it all the way. Creationism was, of course, true. Evolution is all nonsense. Christian. And it was in college, and it was having a debate with this girl that I had a crush on. And the way we would flirt with each other is we would have theological arguments with each other. And so one day we were going at it, and she goes, well, Dave, the Hindu religion is like 3,000 years older than Christianity. And I was all set to jump down her case. And I started to, and then I stopped and I realized, you know what? I have no idea if Hinduism was older than Christianity or not. Turns out it is by quite a bit. But I realized I was about to say something that I didn't know was true or not. And that hit me like a bolt from the blue. It's like, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, just parroting what I was told. Am I right or am I wrong? My God, what have I done? And from that moment, that bolt from the blue, that secular epiphany, I was like, wait a minute, is any of this true? I had never asked myself, is Christianity true? I was raised a Christian. Of course, Christianity was true. True. We defend the truth. We hold up the truth. But I never asked, is Christianity true? How do we know it's true? And from that moment on, I was just walking around in a daze because Christianity suddenly felt and looked and smelled obviously fake. Like I went back to church. I was like, oh my God, this is all made up. And like a month later, I had to quit going on a Cambodian mission, between the services. I couldn't do it anymore. After I said, I'm sorry, I'm out. I can't do it. I didn't tell anybody that, but I just stopped going and did not go back ever again. And a couple years later, after I'd been living in sin with my girlfriend for years, I sat down with my folks and said, I'm getting ready to move to San Francisco, but I don't even know why I need to tell you this because you probably already know this, but I'm not a Christian anymore. And even though I had stopped going to church and was living in sin, it freaked them right out. They did not see it coming. And
They stopped talking to you?
They didn't. But it's funny. My mom was raised Southern Baptist in Oklahoma with her very controlling mom. My dad was really the only one in his family to become a Christian. So I expected her to totally get it because she's a little bit of a rebel that way, and him not to get it. Exact opposite. he kind of got it because we sort of did the same thing, just in the opposite direction. And Mom was like, "Oh," and still never gotten over it. Yeah. And the wild thing for me was, it's like, I didn't have to start, oh, okay, I'm going to have to reinvestigate things. Like, of course, evolution was true. Of course, I didn't have to like think about it for another minute. It's like that pressure of saying, no, Noah's Ark, science, carbon dating is bullshit. All that pressure of having to defend that nonsense went away instantly. Um, and I think the funniest thing about it, I mean, for like 6 months to a year, I was walking around in a daze because I had always thought God was looking out for me and had a perfect plan for me and all this. And I tell people it was like being in an airplane and having the bottom dropped out, but instead of falling, I was still flying. And it was like, well, what's keeping me up? Where's my magic shield of protection from God, keeping me safe from all harm? But I think the funniest thing for me was how much less judgment I became and how much more accepting I was of everybody that I bumped into. I became so much more Christ-like when I gave up being a Christian, because I didn't have to go around like the Terminator saying, oh, they believe that, they're going to hell. Oh, they believe that, they're going to heaven. It's like, we're all human. All of us suddenly look exactly like we belong here. We came from here. We're all related. Yeah, it was really an amazing moment for me, and that it just kept getting better and better the more I got used to the fact that, yeah, this doesn't make sense.
Mm.
And it's all the good things that you like about Christianity, you can hang on to them. You're just getting rid of the bullshit.
Yeah.
And the toxic parts.
Yeah. When I first heard Bart Ehrman, I read one of his books, and he talked about there's nothing written about Jesus in the first century.
Yeah.
I would love for you to touch on Josephus and see who he was, and maybe because he claimed to have evidence, right? They claim to have evidence of him.
He's the one historian that Christians will point to, is Josephus. And I like what Bart Ehrman says. He says, you know what? Even if every single thing in Josephus is true, it still doesn't add anything to the discussion, really, because he's just repeating what Christians of his time were repeating. But that said, let's look at him, because I have a whole chapter about him in Nailed. And again, he's, when we look at the first century, we don't have any contemporary witnesses for Jesus. Your pastor will tell you, oh, we have like 50 of them. There's so many, I can't even count. None of them are contemporary. The closest thing we get to a contemporary witness for Jesus is this guy named Flavius Josephus, this Jewish historian in the first century. Now, he was born after Jesus supposedly died, and he was writing in the 90s. So this is almost 100 years after the birth of Jesus. There's two things that Christians point to. And there's one thing called the Testimonium Flavianum. And that's this little paragraph tucked in the middle of this chapter that's talking about other things. But in the middle of all this doom and gloom, this bad things that are happening in Jerusalem, there's suddenly this paragraph that says, oh, and there was about this time a man named Jesus, if we can even call him a man, because he did such wonderful, amazing miracles and blah, blah, blah. And he founded this religion, and the tribe name for him is still going strong, and he was awesome, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes back to the doom and gloom of the rest of the chapter. Now, nobody in historical circles thinks that is not a forgery. Nobody does. But what they've moved the field goal is to say, is all the Christians say, well, yeah, I mean, it's been tampered with. Sure. I mean, clearly a Jew didn't write this. Clearly a Pharisee didn't write this. But what happened was he probably did mention Jesus, and some medieval monk changed things around. And so it's like, fine, you want to go that route? Okay, first of all, that's suspicious AF for starters. But the problem is, and again, I've got a whole chapter talking about why this is a bullshit argument. Because for 300 years, nobody seems to have found this little paragraph. And for 200 years after that, nobody seems to have found this paragraph. But 300 years later, this guy named Bishop Eusebius, that says, hey, look what I found in this copy of Josephus. And it's this, he talks about Jesus. Well, one of the many, many problems with the fact that for half a millennia, nobody knows it except for this guy, is that he got his copy, his book, from a church father who famously complained about Josephus never mentioning Jesus. He mentions John the Baptist, He never mentions Jesus. And that's the copy of the book that this guy suddenly finds this paragraph that claims to be a commercial for Jesus. It's ridiculous. There's other reasons we can get to. There's a second reference about a guy named Jesus, and it tells you which Jesus it's. Jesus, son of
Yeah.
David. It's not even our Jesus. It makes no sense if it's about our Jesus. And I'm shocked that atheists even give that any time of day. I can get the whole, well, maybe it was something he wrote and it got tampered with. I mean, that argument can take you only so far. I don't buy it for a minute, but at least that's something. The other one, ridiculous. So this is what we've got. So at the very end of the first century, we have a guy who wasn't an eyewitness repeating something, if it's not a forgery at all. If we take away those two witnesses, we've got nothing for the first century Christianity outside the Bible to corroborate it. And the witnesses only come after that in the second century, third century, even later, and they're all clearly working off of the Gospels. So we don't have any independent sources to corroborate our four Gospels.
And people don't realize that the disciples were not eyewitnesses.
Such a good point. Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the first things that was a red flag for me, looking into the Jesus story. Because I set out, I was curious to know which of the Gospels gives us the real Jesus and which is just legendary bullshit that came later. Because none of the Gospels really agree on who Jesus was and what he did. The first three are clearly taken from the first one, Mark. Not our first gospel in the lineup, but it's the oldest gospel, and it's the shortest and the most low frills gospel we have. Matthew and Luke were clearly taken from that. John sort of takes the major story from those three, but he actually doesn't even try to match them up. He goes off in his own direction and says whatever he wants to about Jesus and what he did and what his career was like, and it doesn't even match up with the other two. Not that they always match up either, but you can tell, we know that those were all came from Mark's gospel originally, what we call Mark's gospel. And that gospel, again, I can't stress this enough, because all our biographical information from the whole world stems from those four gospels. And there are other gospels, of course, but everything we know as Christians comes from those four gospels. All four of them are really taken from the first one. And that first one, Mark's gospel, seems to be a complete allegory from start to finish. It's not even writing a history. He's writing a once upon a time allegory.
And they're all written every 10 years.
Yeah. There's at least. I mean, Matthew was probably 10 years or more after Mark. Mark was probably written right after the war with Rome in the first century, and probably directly because of that war in Rome, where he was writing this thing to give people hope and say, yeah, the temple's destroyed, but you know what? It's fine because we are Christians now. We don't need that temple. We God made it okay. This is how he did it. He tells us what if God was one of us story. And again, his Jesus is different from all the other Jesuses, especially John's. His Jesus, the first Jesus, is just a normal human guy like us. He's not God. He's not part of a Trinity. And at his baptism, God says, you know what? I see good things in you. You're going to be my son. I'm promoting you. And then at the end of his story, because he went through it all, before he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, because he got crucified and was so obedient, God anoints him to Lord after that. So he becomes God at his death. Until then, he's just a miracle worker who God works through. And it's wild to read Mark without thinking about what we think of, and then read the other Gospels. John's the complete opposite. I say in Nail that he's a Superman without a Clark Kent, because he was God before he was born, he was God after he was born, and he's just slumming it on earth through his entire gospel. And it's amazing he wasn't stoned for blasphemy just right out of the gate, because he's not even trying to hide the fact that he and God are one. And
Well, I wonder if whoever wrote the Gospel of John had some influence with the Bhagavad Gita with Krishna.
Well, there are signs that that early Christians, maybe 100 years later, maybe not in John's time, certainly were aware of the Buddha and of Hinduism.
Mm.
And there's some writings that seem to imply that there was missionary work from like India and China coming into the Greek speaking countries. So maybe, and it just might be that they're all coming about this whole thing about these religious stages just coming to fruition at the same time. And that's why you have the same situation over here in a different country, in a different culture, but they're trying to solve the same problems. And that's why these religious leaders seem to be saying the same kind of things in different ways.
I love the Gospel of Thomas. I think it's a great, for my own individual journey. I mean, some of it, the principle behind it's beautiful. There's some nice sayings, but yeah, again, I just don't hold on too tightly to the stories. The principles are some beautiful principles in there, but I don't get like, it doesn't bother me if someone could say F the Gospel of Thomas, but then F the Gospel of Thomas. I don't care. Just there's some stuff that speak to me in there. Even like in John,
for me about Zen Buddhism too. There's a lot of cool Zen Buddhism.
I love Zen. Yeah, and whether they were real or not, I think if I could apply those principles, it'll make me more, because it's really about taking responsibility for your own mind,
Right, absolutely, and that's something you get in those Gnostic gospels, so-called Gnostic gospels. Don't get in Orthodox gospels. What's inside of you, has to come out, and that's where you look for these things, not outside yourself. Yeah. I love that too.
What are some of the stories that you found that came from other sources, other cultures, other ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia or Egypt or even Plato?
That have impacted me. That's a good question, and I have to think about that for a minute, because there's so many, especially like the poetry that we get from like Aztec poetry. Really, I find really moving. And Aztec culture and Aztec religion is pretty scary. I think it's just as scary as anything from the Spanish brought over. I like ancient Celtic culture too. The mythology and the poetry of that as well. I'm a big fan of all that. But there's honestly every culture I bump into and read their mythologies and read their literature, I'm always touched by it, because it just really underscores how we're all humans, and we sound different, look different, act different, but at the end of the day, you can really see the connections much stronger than the differences.
Do you think there's a connection between Isis and Horus with Mother Mary and Jesus?
Absolutely. Artistically, there's no doubt whatsoever. Theologically and religiously, it's less direct than that, but definitely, let's see, what's the easiest way to back up into this part? I follow the scholars who claim that Christianity began as what was called a mystery faith or a mystery religion. And what those was they started, the earliest one was in ancient Greece, in Eleutheus, if I'm saying that right, the Eleusinian mysteries, where it started as a harvest festival, but what it became was sort of a secret club with secret handshakes and doctrines, and it was the most unique thing about it is it became a personal savior. The goddess or the god, depending which one you were talking about, they lived in your heart. They weren't like up on Mount Olympus like some big pantheon. They were in your heart, and you lived in them. You were reborn through them. They'd have things like baptisms and Lord or Lady suppers. And during the time of Alexander the Great, when he unites all these different cultures, you start seeing this religious movement of these mystery faiths, where what they would usually do, they would take a god, a native god like Isis in Egypt or Mitra in Thrace, different ones from different places, and they kind of reboot them. Instead of being part of Pantheon, they were a new mystery savior. And they would live in your heart. And everything we know about early Christianity looks exactly like the guys who created this were creating a Jewish version the local Jewish version of a mystery faith. The connections are just impossible to deny. So, of course, Christian preachers deny them super vociferously. And it's very funny to see their arguments, how poorly they hold up. You just really cannot deny that this is what's happening.
You know what I find interesting is in ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, before the Greeks named it hieroglyphs, their writings, but the ancient Kemetic people, they called it Medoneture, which means God's words. And then later the Bible comes out to be the word of God. Or even in the Gita, it's the Song of God. You know, is that an influence on the Christian Bible? I always ask myself that.
I probably think that they were coming up to the same conclusions separately of each other. And again, because they were going through the same processes of creating these religions. And generally, at least not all religions, but the major ones that stick and become world religions, the top 10 or so, they all came from above, not from below. It's not like there was this man named Jesus and his words spread out over. No, there was an emperor and he said, I like this religion. Let's boost you up a little bit. Because for hundreds of years, Christianity was just invisible socially. When people talk about that, the Romans must have invented it for crowd control and stuff like that. No, it was smaller than Hare Krishnas are now. It was basically invisible until it got all this divine favor centuries later. And we could say much the same with all the other religions as well.
I think one thing I really wanted to ask you was, did you find anything with your research outside of the Bible written about Jesus? Outside of the Gospels?
Short answer, no. Nothing contemporary. And in fact, in Nailed, I talk about here's all these guys who were on the scene that should have noticed somebody like Jesus. And we've got all these guys who were noticed at the time, these other wannabe messiahs and these loser messiahs. But all of them, they're not very impressive. You know, they don't do that much, but every single one of them made a dent in the historical record, and that's more than Jesus ever did. Even John the Baptist. It wouldn't shock me if it turned out there was no John the Baptist, and he was just as mythical as Jesus. But if I had to put money on one of them, my money would be on John the Baptist, because there's a little more evidence for him than Jesus. Not a lot, but there's a little bit more. And I could see Christianity being a spinoff of John the Baptist's cult more than I could see John the Baptist being a spinoff of the Jesus cult. But in a nutshell, contemporarily, no, nobody talks about Jesus. Nobody sees any of these things happening. And they don't start talking about Jesus until, again, almost a century after the fact. And usually when they're talking about Jesus, they're talking about this religion called Christians. And Jesus is an afterthought of that, if they even mention Jesus. Usually that crucified guy, the Christians worship.
No, I find that interesting. There's nothing written with all these miracles. You know, I understand people didn't know how to read and write like today, but someone's going to document that stuff outside of the Gospels.
and again, all these other losers, they did document, but somehow they missed the best one of them all, who did all these more amazing things. Yeah.
Even in the lost, the lost years, they call them, right? When they supposedly Jesus was in India and all that. And that sounds pretty. It makes a little bit more sense to me. But where's the evidence? Like they talk about, they have these documents in Tibet or whatever. Okay, well, why can't we see them? Or the Muslims may have some a body in India. Okay, well, why can't we see it? Why can't we take samples? I've even heard that there's some stuff in Japan about Jesus. Well, why can't we take samples of this stuff to get rid of the doubts? None
of them actually have a body or a grave or anything like that. You know, there's just legends. Like I'm sure the Japanese one started in the 17th century when the Christian monks first came there. That place where Jesus supposedly and his brother, I guess, came there and went to Japan. I mean, we see the same thing in Britain. Everybody wanted Jesus to come to their place, you know. I read a really interesting book about the history of Christianity from like the year for the first 2,000 years, but especially on the Middle Ages. And it made the point that this was a Middle Eastern religion. And everything takes place in like the Levant and Persia and Egypt. Those are the fringes. But it's so bizarre that just kind of by accident of history, it went into Europe and Europe became Christian. It's kind of like the way South America and Africa and Korea are now becoming super Christian. And maybe in 50 years, America won't be Christian at all. Christianity will only be in places like Korea and Japan and sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, it's wild, just how improbable it all is, and yet here we go. We think that, there's not going to be a white Jesus in 50 years. It's going to be an African Jesus or Korean Jesus or South American Jesus.
But Paul was a real character, do you believe?
I do. In fact, I talk about in Playing God, like the reasons we know there was a Paul and the reasons we know there was not a Jesus. And the tricky thing about Paul, though, we have to remember is that there's more than one Paul. I'd say there's 4 Pauls, because we've got the Paul of his real genuine letters, who was the real guy, who we don't really like so much. He kind of is bitchy, doesn't seem to like girls very much, and he's constantly saying things like, "I'm not lying, I swear to you. I swear to you, I'm not lying, I'm telling you." But we all love the Paul that Luke gives to us in the book of Acts, because that's a super Paul who's got all these great superpowers and has all these amazing adventures going on. And Paul loves talking about how awesome Paul is, but he never tells us anything remotely like any of those adventures that Luke gives us. Like the road on Damascus, Paul never says that. Luke gives us 3 incompatible versions of the same story, but Paul never says anything like that.
I posted something about us, upcoming episode on my feed on YouTube, and
Yeah.
I had a good friend that said, "Well, what about the near-death experiencers that see Jesus and the when they have their near-death and when they have their near-death experiences?" I go, "Well, because it's by looking up and interviewing people or just looking at interviews with people that have near-death experiences,
Yeah.
I realize that our conditioned beliefs have that effect with the near-death experiences." I don't know.
The same thing with like drug hallucinations. People who think, "Oh, I went to hell," the people who already believed in hell have those experiences, Yeah. But yeah, it's really interesting how neuropsychology and just the science, brain science, the more we learn about the way our brains work, and like, oh, if we push activate this portion of the brain, all of a sudden we have an out-of-body experience, or we have this transcendent experience. This part of the brain that like tells us where we start and stop, if you turn that off, all of a sudden, woo, we're a part of that whole universe. And I don't say that to make fun of it or make light of it, because it's a real phenomenon. It's a real thing.
I've had those experiences, so that's why I'm smiling.
Exactly. But what I am saying is that those seem to come out of our brain, and our magnificent brains that can do all these wonderful things. That's a side effect of certain conditions on the brain. In fact, apparently there's a kind of magnetic helmet you can put on and flip a switch and create that sensation, because it activates that part of the brain.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's also interesting, like people who have that tunnel experience where they go through the tunnel and they go into heaven, they never see like, Daffy Duck or Mikhail Gorbachev. It's always grandma and grandpa, but people have those experiences. Those just don't make it into the journals. It's like, yeah, I saw Matt Dillahunty was on drugs one time. He says, "I saw Super Strawberry Man," the superhero names, that was half strawberry, half Superman. But those things don't make it as compelling a story as seeing your dead uncle or your grandparents, or
The virgin birth. What's your take on the virgin birth? You hear some scholars say it means young woman, but you also see there's other virgin birth stories in
Right.
other cultures.
Right. And yeah, let's take those separately for a second. So the prophecy that says he would be born of a virgin, that comes from Matthew, and he's taking a Old Testament prophecy that's talking about when this young woman gives birth, then you'll see all these things happening. it's not talking about a virgin. It's just talking about a young maiden, and it's talking about that particular situation. I want to say that's in Isaiah, and yeah, that's clear. Mark, our oldest gospel, doesn't have a virgin birth. John casually mentions that that his parents are Mary and Joseph without any explanation about God being involved in it at all. And Matthew and Luke both have genealogies for Jesus, which is crazy because they all go through Joseph, and they don't match each other. They're not even the same number of generations. And there's other verses in the New Testament where it talks about, not paying attention to genealogies. Those aren't important. And the book of Hebrews says Jesus doesn't have a genealogy. And yet, yeah, we've got two of them. So you can tell things have been added as the story continues to grow. Robert Price talks about how we have these stories of young Jesus when he was a boy, and only one of them made it into our gospel. But there used to be all these other stories, about what was, young Jesus growing up in Nazareth and all his adventures. And it's just like Superboy and Smallville comics. Like, they wanted to know that story of what happened while Superman was growing up. And the only story that's left in our Bibles is the story where he's a 12-year-old boy in Luke, and he goes missing for 3 days, and they find him in the temple. Yeah, exactly. But the virgin, to get back to the virgin, so most of them don't have a virgin. That was just this one, couple gospels that did that. And again, they also have tacked in these genealogies that don't match with a virgin birth. And it's funny, when you read Matthew's nativity story and Luke's nativity story, they don't add up at all. If you only read one and never read the other, we would never have our Christmas plays at the elementary school, because all the elements, none of these elements that have been crammed together work when you separate them out. But somehow we've mashed them up into this one super story of wise men and shepherds at night, even though the Matthew story is this really dark, scary story, and Luke's is this happy, feel-good story. They don't have anything in common with each other. And it's fun to read through them separately now, and you realize that, yeah, somebody's done a really great mashup on these two incompatible stories.
Interesting. Have you ever read? Sorry, go ahead.
You get away, and you're right. There's that whole idea of a virgin birth shows up in a lot of different ways in Buddha and Jainism, and you name it, all across the world. And it has to do with those myths about being a demigod and a human woman giving birth to a divine son. Like, it's not a coincidence that when you have Greek culture spreading and all these myths about that kind of thing happening, that's when all of a sudden Yahweh has a son named Jesus. It's not a coincidence that didn't happen until after that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was going to mention the hymns of Akhenaten. I don't know if you ever read that, and how it matches Psalms 104. Like it's like almost word for word. It changed a little bit, but you can tell it came from there.
Sure.
Just thought that was interesting.
I'm really glad you brought him up, because in Playing God, I talk about Akhenaten. He's the first monotheist. And you talk about Egyptian influences on Christianity. We do deep dives into that. Think about Akhenaten, and that psalm probably is taken directly from Akhenaten. It's not a coincidence. The fun thing about Akhenaten is we've known he was the first monotheist, and people have debated about, well, did he get that from Moses? Is that where that came from? But the funny thing is, and I talk about this at great length in Playing God, is the story of Moses. If you ask a biblical historian, they'll say, "Oh, Moses was probably 1600 BC or 1200 BC, somewhere around that." It's getting really fuzzy because they really can't quite pin it down. Maybe it had to do with Ramses II. We don't know. But the problem is, it turns out that our story of Moses is about 1,000 years younger than that. It doesn't show up until the 3rd century, until about the year 273 or 272. That's how finally we can pinpoint it, where it came from. And the story of Moses is fascinating because a Greek writer wrote this Greek story, adventure story about an Egyptian who goes and founds an Egyptian colony of lepers in what we call Judea. Another Egyptian, about a century after that, wrote another story where he kind of plays with that idea, and he includes his story in his own story of Egypt. And our story of Moses comes after that, shortly after that. And it's clearly responding to everything that they say in that story. It's like, oh, no, Moses wasn't a leper. He just had this miracle where he could make his hand look leprous, Oh, no, he didn't do this. He wasn't really Egyptian. He was a Hebrew prince, it was raised by the Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter, just like Sargon II had been. It's like point after point after point. It's taking this Egyptian story and making taking out all the stuff that's anti-Jewish or the thing that just depicts Jews in an unflattering light and makes them look better. And those first 5 books of Moses in our Bibles, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it appears, and this is one of the things that blew my mind and made me want to write this book. It appears those things were written for the first time in the year 273 or 272 in Alexandria, Egypt, by the Jewish scholars who were commissioned to write a history of the Jews by the Pharaoh. It's wild to me.
Well, it's interesting you brought up Akhenaten and monotheism because I took a class a couple years back on religion, and the professor snapped on me eventually. But he gave all the credit to Moses for monotheism. He's like, thank God for monotheism, Judaism, and he starts going off with Moses. But I go, what about Akhenaten or Zoroaster? Zoroaster.
Oh, Zoroaster's the other one I want to talk about because he's really the first real monotheist. I say he, but there was no him. That religion is the first monotheism. Zoroastrianism, and for those who are not keeping up, that is this ancient religion out of Persia. Zoroastrianism is clearly the granddaddy. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You don't have those 3 religions without Zoroastrianism first. And that's something that historians have been coming to terms with and accepting in recent years as well. But there's so many things you just cannot deny. This came straight into Judaism from Zoroastrianism. In fact, I would also argue that Judaism itself wasn't even invented until after the Jews came home from that Babylonian captivity, when they were soaking in Zoroastrianism, basically, for generations. Before that, Francesca Stravacapoulou has a great book called God and Anatomy. And there's other great books just talking about how polytheism was the religion of the Canaanites and the Israelites and the Judahites, who were all the same people, basically. They didn't come, out of Egypt. And then, Abraham didn't come from Iraq. The people coming home from Babylon came to Israel from out of Iraq. They didn't drive out all the Canaanites from the Promised Land. They were Canaanites. That's where they came from, and that's where they came back to. It's so fascinating how topsy-turvy Israelite history has come just in very recent years. And there's a Tel Aviv archaeologist now named Jonathan Atler. While I was in the middle of writing this book and talking about all the scholars, particularly a scholar named Russell Gurmerkin, who's made these points that, we don't have any evidence for any of this until the year 273, 272. At just like a year into this project, Jonathan Atler drops this bombshell of archaeology where he says, we don't have any archaeological evidence of Judaism before the 3rd century BCE. Exactly tracks with the time Gurmerkin is talking about. So it's like the Jewish kingdom that gave us Herod the Great, his whole dynasty, the Maccabees, that Maccabee revolution that led to Judea becoming an independent kingdom until the Romans took it over. That seems to be where we get the Maccabees, where we get the Judaism itself, the religion we think of as Judaism. Before that, Yahweh was just one of many gods that was worshipped in Israel. In fact, in the 7th century, the number one archaeological artifact that is found in that period in archaeology in the Holy Land are goddess figures. Overwhelming. We have hundreds of them.
Interesting.
Which means we have so much better evidence, physical evidence for goddess worship than we do for David's kingdom, Solomon's kingdom, the first temple. We have much better evidence that was the case than any of the stories in the Old Testament leading up to, the Babylonian captivity or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought all that up because, I was mentioning going back to school and I don't have an education under my belt. As a matter of fact, the religious teacher that snapped on me said, I have a learning disorder.
Yeah. He's the one that has a learning disorder. Yeah.
And then I had, and luckily I'm not a young guy that just fall for that kind of stuff. But, anyways, I was taking a philosophy class at the same time, which was his best friend. And he gave me that, he was teaching on Rene Descartes. And he was like sharing how he came up with, I think, therefore I am. And I raised my hand. I says, he forgot one thing. You're not your thoughts. You're the awareness behind your thoughts. And he got all pissed off. But anyways, later, there's the book right above your book, Nailed, is called The Jesus Gate. And I found Ernie Bringas. He's another professor that taught biblical stuff too. But what I like about The Jesus Gate is that he goes, I wrote this because I wanted to be honest. And I think it's hard for people to really look at history and with that honest lens and not get the biases and beliefs in the way. And he was just very real. He was very honest. And he goes, yeah, I'm going to show you the stuff they're not telling you in the Bible. And it's a beautiful book. And, but it made me happy to see how he brought up the Atrahasis and the Elish. I'm saying it wrong.
Yeah. Gilgamesh and all. Yep. Yeah.
So, he brings that up and I'm thankful for that because it's becoming more popular now, but, Noah's story is not original. A lot of the flood stories were in all cultures, even the Aztec and the Maya. But I just appreciated that, being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a bombshell that was when they found the Gilgamesh story and realized, oh, yeah, this is exactly from that. One of the ironies that comes in playing God is, I said there were 2 books that we got our first 5 books of Moses from. One is a Babylonian book from a priest named Berosus, who writes this. This guy Manetho was writing a history of Egypt. He was writing a history of Babylon, and he tells all these myths of Gilgamesh and all these things. But our version in our books in Genesis, they match his book more than they match the originals, and it's like, for the longest time, we've been aware of these 2 books from the 3rd century BC, but everyone assumed that that's the Babylonian take on our Old Testament. That's the Egyptian take on our Moses story. And we realized, oh no, these were written before those were written, and our story is clearly based off of those 2 books, even more so than the original Babylonian mythology. So it's just mind-blowing. The connections, being able to see the actual connections of this stuff, and not just saying, well, it's all Babylonian mythology. Yeah, it is, but it comes from this book by a real person whose name we knew, and he wrote it in this year. And it's wild because we think of our scriptures, when you say the word scripture, it's like it just came floating down from heaven, and we don't really think about where it comes from, and that human beings wrote it. And they copied other things and took things from other things they liked. And, but you really see the human creation of, whatever you want to call scripture. These books, these human books made by humans for humans. We really, the more we study them, the more we see the fingerprints and how they're connected to places like Persia, places like India, places like Egypt. How Canaanites and Israelites and Judahites are all the same people, and that's kind of a too. Um,
Well, that
yeah,
always amazes me that most people don't really take a deep dive in the history and how it all came about. Like he even said that we're not even sure if Abraham was real.
yeah.
And
Oh,
Abraham supposedly came out of Mesopotamia.
yeah. I'm willing to bet money he was not real. In fact, I talk about in Playing God. There's like 3 kinds of bullshit that the Old Testament gives us. First, you get pure myth. Moses, Noah, the Tower of Babel. I mean, even biblical historians won't start with those stories. They just start, they'll tiptoe and pretend like it all started with Abraham and that he was a real guy. So pure myth. But then you got from legends from like Abraham to Solomon. You have these stories, and none of them appear to be real people. There's some of the judges maybe were based on a real person. The Judge Deborah is at least plausible. Were they real people? Samson wasn't. He's clearly a sun god, and we've got all this evidence I talked about in Playing God that connects him to the sun god Shamash, and to Hercules. And they have this joint track of evolution that I like to get onto. Um, it's fascinating. It's just one thing after another in these books. You find this fascinating thing and fascinating thing and another fascinating thing. And it's so fun to see all the pieces of the puzzle start to connect together. Um, but anyway, so you got myth, you have legends, and then when you get into real history, starting about 100 years after the time of Solomon, um, you have real people, real political figures, but we're getting the propaganda version. So it's like, yeah, there was a King Hezekiah, but no, God didn't come and the angel of the Lord didn't slaughter 30,000 of his men. He actually lost. And, the story we're getting does not match the stories we get from archaeology and from the other reports from other countries. Um, and it's ironic that, for instance, one of the people who is real in the Old Testament is Jezebel and her husband, and they're 2 of the most hated people in the whole Bible. But got better evidence for them than anybody between Abraham and Solomon. We know those are real people, even if the stories they give us in the Bible have been altered to make them look bad.
You know, the Israelites were prisoners of the Babylonians at one time. So they heard a lot of these stories. And I guess my question was, do you believe that Elohim, a lot of people say it's plural.
It is, yeah.
Is that
I mean,
from like,
it's a plural and a feminine word.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you believe those stories came from the Anunnaki?
Well,
Is there a connection there?
I mean, not directly, I would say, but it's clear that the religion of Judaism, of Yahwehism, let's say, just say, oh yeah, all these other gods, we're just going to pick this one here, and this is going to be our God. Boom. It's kind of the same thing that happened with the mystery faiths. There was all these gods floating around, all these gods being worshipped by the Israelites and the Judeans and all these other kingdoms, the Moabites, Ammonites, you name it. But they finally just picked one and said, that's the one true God. And what the Jews did, is they retroactively said, and that's the way it always has been. Oh, since the dawn of time, since Father Abraham. And everything else, they just kept forgetting and going back to this newfangled foreign, polytheism. It's like they always treat it as, Jezebel's so evil. She's a woman, and women make good Jewish boys worship false gods from other countries. But these are pure, native, soaked in the Bible gods and theologies. And even though the whole of the the Old Testament rather, is trying to sell you this story about how they were always monotheism right from the get-go. Even saying that, you can still see the traces of the polytheism. Like when God says to Moses, oh yeah, in those days I was called something else. Yeah, I was called El. Don't let that fool you.
Well, speaking of that, there's a verse where it says El got assigned the north and Yahweh got assigned the south. Wait, what?
Yeah.
What? And I told a Jehovah's Witness this, and they kind of freaked out. They were very unfamiliar with the Old Testament for some reason.
Yeah, and so they get a lot wrong, just flat out pure wrong. But yes, Yahweh seems to be a Midianite god. He came from the mountain area there, and there was more than one kind. There was like Yahweh of this, Yahweh of that. So different religions had their Yahweh, and he was he was like Baal. He was a warrior god and a storm god, a weather god, and he brought the rains, and he, wore everything they liked and needed. He provided for, especially war and weather. Where was I going with that thought? Oh, and El, which is just the word for God, he was the supreme god of the Canaanites, the northern Canaanites. So everywhere up to like Syria and Syria and Lebanon today, that area, all the way down to the border with Egypt, basically, and Jordan. They were all basically the same peoples. They spoke pretty much the same language. They were different tribes, and there were more than 12 tribes, for instance. There were tons of tribes. But they all worshipped forms of these gods. Baal, El, and Baal just means master or Lord. El just means God, and Yahweh is the name of one of these gods. And again, Elohim is a plural noun. They talk about the council of the gods. Even that's still made it into the Bible, and you see it translated as that. Or the host of heaven is, should be better translated as the council of the gods. There's so many cases of that, and there's a whole chapter in Playing God where I talk about all the different gods that the Israelites and the Judeans worship. And I keep splitting those up because there never was a united kingdom of David and Solomon. Judah was its own thing. Israel was its own thing. Samaria was its own thing. But together, we're all talking about that whole Mesopotamian region between Egypt and Babylon, Egypt and Assyria. Pretty much that Western Semitic culture tracked wherever you went.
Thank you.
Even as I'm talking to you, I keep biting my tongue. It's like, oh, and I could tell you about this. Oh, I could tell you about this. Goals we could go down to, and I'm trying to resist and stay on target.
People don't realize, like, even the Buddha, like, there's nothing that he wrote down, and nothing's written about him till years later. I think when we can realize that no one owns the full-on truth, everything comes from myth, but we can learn from myth. Like we can learn, like when archetypes, like Christ and Buddha. Maybe it'll get rid of some like egotism or I'm better than you, or we carry the truth and you don't, and get rid of all that stuff.
When you treat these as literary characters, it kind of flips everything. It's like we can really learn from them as literary figures. When we try to worship them and try to second guess, well, which is the real Jesus and which is the real Buddha, that's when we start. It's like there is no such thing. There's no thing. It's like the real Luke Skywalker. These are literary characters. They're our beloved characters. They'll live forever. I'm sure we'll be talking about Jesus and Buddha and Luke Skywalker 1,000 years from now if we don't blow ourselves up. But yeah, they're human creations. I don't know if you ever saw that South Park episode, Imagination Land.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really funny, crazy episode, like everything in South Park. But one of the last lines was Stan making that point. It's like, these guys never existed, but they're more famous than we ever are. Everyone knows them. And they'll live forever. They'll never die. And it's like, it's so true.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you one more thing. It just popped up in my head as we're talking. Lee Strobel. He came up with that documentary, The Case of Christ, but it was very, very, he got his answers because he only interviewed people where he's going to get the right information that he wanted. Have you ever debated with someone like that? I exchanged a few words with him some years ago.
I haven't debated him or anything like that, but let me just say, he is so full of shit. He is. His story is such crap. His book is such crap. The movie they've made about his book is crap on crap. In a nutshell, he was a Christian pastor for 10 years before and this was the third book he wrote, where he talked about, I used to be a tough, cynical skeptic when I was a newspaper reporter, which is all true. He was, but he became a Christian. Then he became a pastor. he started this thing of investigating to see if it was true and interviewing these people. And funny fact is, one of the people he interviewed, somebody asked him, well, when you said this in the book, he says, well, wait, I got to stop you there. I didn't actually say that. Well, he kind of wrote that. And it's like, are you kidding me? You didn't even say the thing. So it's not just that he cherry picked his experts, but he actually pretty much put in their mouths too. So it's no wonder they all sound alike, and they all sound like evangelical preachers. I've got a whole talk I do just on what a load of crap that book is and the movie it's based on. Don't get me started on that guy.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a couple of quick questions that I ask everyone.
All right.
What's the purpose of life for you?
For me, the nice thing is it's for everybody can say it's what we make of it. That's what our purpose is. I mean, you can answer it in any number of ways. Hey, how would you come here? You. What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to sit around and sleep most of the day and eat food and get worshiped like we didn't eat in Egypt. That's her purpose. We find our purpose. That's a beautiful thing. And what scares people so much is that we're the ones who find that purpose. The search for a purpose is what gives us purpose in a lot of ways. It can be what you want to be. There's a great quote about what are you going to do with your one unique and magnificent life. And it's not a exhortation to go work out and, create a new light bulb. It was a poem about somebody who was looking at grasshoppers in the garden, And that was, then she asked the question, what are you going to do with your life? It's a scary thing to some people that we're the ones who decide. But I think it's exhilarating and wonderful and scary.
Awesome.
It's all those things, just like the universe itself.
What's one of the misunderstood things people get from atheists?
I think the funniest thing I get was when I tell people atheists and they say, but you're so happy. And they have the idea that, we're all black beret chain smokers sitting around in French bistros going, that is meaningless, and it can be that way if you want to, but there's no reason for it to be. I think the biggest mistake is that atheists are any one thing. Atheism is just anybody who says, you know what, I don't have a belief in a God. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's not. That would be an agnostic. But I don't see any evidence for one. And everything about the way our universe looks like there's not a God and never has been. And all our attempts to find one, those are all clearly false gods. But this one God over here, that's the one true God. That seems ridiculous to me. Personally, myself, I'm fascinated by religion. Theology really bores me, but the evolution of religion and seeing where these things came from and how they developed and the people who brought them to us and what they were trying to create, that fascinates me. I'm really blown away by it. Sometimes it makes me shake my head. It's like, oh my God, this is so stupid. How could he even do this? And sometimes it makes me laugh so hard when I'm describing these things in these books, which I think people appreciate that. I think makes it very accessible, and it's like when you're watching the news and Trump does something really stupid, and you would be going insane if it was just you listening to this. But if you watch like Stephen Colbert or Seth Meyers, and through that lens, it's like, yeah, it's not just me. That is crazy. And that's my books are about religion. It's like, yeah, you're not wrong. This is crazy buckets, and here's why. And it's even crazier than you think. But it's fascinating. And again, it shows how human these all are, and we're all human. And there's something beautiful about the way humans have tried to make sense of the universe, this big squirrely universe of ours that can be so overwhelming and magnificent and terrifying and horrifying, beautiful, all at the same time throughout history.
Yeah, thank you. My last one was, with all the chaos going around in the world today, all the division, war, hate.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we had you on a big screen in the sky and everyone had to tune in to you, what would be your message to the world?
Oh God, I'd be terrified to do that because I don't. My shoes aren't big enough to fill that role. But in a sense, I would do what I'm doing now and just say, you know what, folks, let's take a minute and just talk about these religions that all this is being done in the name of. Let me just share some things with you and see if you see what you think afterward. So I guess that is what I would do, is just say, hey, I know you believe this is your God and all, but maybe not. Maybe it is. Yeah, that's probably the best I can do. Yeah.
I love that, because the guy in back of me, Thich Nhat Hanh, Zen master, he would say, until there's peace amongst the religions, there can be peace in the world. So
yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm going to end it with a quote by Krishnamurti. He said, when you call yourself an Indian or a Muslim or a Christian or a European or anything else, you are being violent. Do you see why it is violent? Because you are separating yourself from the rest of humankind. When you separate yourself by belief, by nationality, by tradition, it breeds violence. So a man who is seeking to understand violence does not belong to any country, to any religion, to any political party or partial system. He is concerned with the total understanding of mankind. So Thanks for coming on. I appreciate you coming on.
Me. I love that.
Thank you.
Love that book. And I love being here with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on a day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the nation.